Random House Audio presents The Associate by John Grisham. Read for you by Erik Singer. Chapter 1. The rules of the New Haven Youth League required that each kid play at least 10 minutes in each game. Exceptions were allowed for players who had upset their coaches by skipping practice or violating other rules. In such cases, a coach could file a report before the game and inform the scorekeeper that so-and-so wouldn't play much, if at all, because of some infraction. This was frowned on by the league. It was, after all, much more recreational than competitive. With 4 minutes left in the game, Coach Kyle looked down the bench, nodded at a somber and pouting little boy named Marcus, and said, "Do you want to play?" Without responding, Marcus walked to the scorer's table and waited for a whistle. His violations were numerous: skipping practice, skipping school, bad grades, losing his uniform, foul language. In fact, after 10 weeks and 15 games, Marcus had broken every one of the few rules his coach tried to enforce. Coach Kyle had long since realized that any new rule would be immediately violated by his star, and for that reason he trimmed his list and fought the temptation to add new regulations. It wasn't working. Trying to control 10 inner-city kids with a soft touch had put the Red Knights in last place in the 12-and-under division of the Winter League. Marcus was only 11, but clearly the best player on the court. He preferred shooting and scoring over passing and defending, and within 2 minutes he'd slashed through the lane, around and through and over much larger players, and scored 6 points. His average was 14, and if allowed to play more than half a game, he could probably score 30. In his own young opinion, he really didn't need to practice. In spite of the one-man show, the game was out of reach. Kyle McAvoy sat quietly on the bench, watching the game and waiting for the clock to wind down. 1 game to go and the season would be over, his last as a basketball coach. In 2 years he'd won a dozen, lost 2 dozen, and asked himself how any person in his right mind would willingly coach at any level. He was doing it for the kids, he'd said to himself 1,000 times. Kids with no fathers, kids from bad homes, kids in need of a positive male influence. And he still believed it. But after 2 years of babysitting and arguing with parents when they bothered to show up, and hassling with other coaches who were not above cheating, and trying to ignore teenage referees who didn't know a block from a charge, he was fed up. He'd done his community service, in this town anyway. He watched the game and waited, yelling occasionally because that's what coaches are supposed to do. He looked around the empty gym, an old brick building in downtown New Haven, home to the Youth League for 50 years. A handful of parents were scattered through the bleachers, all waiting for the final horn. Marcus scored again. No one applauded. The Red Knights were down by 12 with 2 minutes to go. At the far end of the court, just under the ancient scoreboard, a man in a dark suit walked through the door and leaned against the retractable bleachers. He was noticeable because he was white. There were no white players on either team. He stood out because he wore a suit that was either black or navy, with a white shirt and a burgundy tie, all under a trench coat that announced the presence of an agent or a cop of some variety. Coach Kyle happened to see the man when he entered the gym, and he thought to himself that the guy was out of place. Probably a detective of some sort, maybe a narc looking for a dealer. It would not be the first arrest in or around the gym. After the agent-cop leaned against the bleachers, he cast a long, suspicious look at the Red Knights bench, and his eyes seemed to settle on Coach Kyle, who returned the stare for a second before it became uncomfortable. Marcus let one fly from near mid-court, airball, and Coach Kyle jumped to his feet, spread his hands wide, shook his head as if to ask, "Why?" Marcus ignored him as he loafed back on defense. A dumb foul stopped the clock and prolonged the misery. While looking at the free-throw shooter, Kyle glanced beyond him. and in the background was the agent cop, still staring, not at the action, but at the coach. For a 25-year-old law student with no criminal record and no illegal habits or proclivities, the presence and the attention of a man who gave all indications of being employed by some branch of law enforcement should have caused no concern whatsoever. But it never worked that way with Kyle McAvoy. Street cops and state troopers didn't particularly bother him. They were paid to simply react. But the guys in dark suits, the investigators and agents, the ones trained to dig deep and discover secrets, those types still unnerved him. 30 seconds to go, and Marcus was arguing with a referee. He'd thrown an F-bomb at a ref 2 weeks earlier and was suspended for a game. Coach Kyle yelled at his star, who never listened. He quickly scanned the gym to see if Agent Cop Number 1 was alone or was now accompanied by Agent Cop Number 2. No, he was not. Another dumb foul, and Kyle yelled at the referee to just let it slide. He sat down and ran his finger over the side of his neck, then flicked off the perspiration. It was early February, and the gym was, as always, quite chilly. Why was he sweating? The agent cop hadn't moved an inch. In fact, he seemed to enjoy staring at Kyle. The decrepit old horn finally squawked. The game was mercifully over. One team cheered, and one team really didn't care. Both lined up for the obligatory high fives and good game, as meaningless to 12-year-olds as it is to college players. As Kyle congratulated the opposing coach, he glanced down the court. The white man was gone. What were the odds he was waiting outside? Of course it was paranoia, but paranoia had settled into Kyle's life so long ago that he now simply acknowledged it, coped with it, and moved on. The Red Knights regrouped in the visitors' locker room, a cramped little space under the sagging and permanent stands on the home side. There, Coach Kyle said all the right things. Nice effort, good hustle, our game is improving in certain areas, let's finish on a high note this Saturday. The boys were changing clothes and hardly listening. They were tired of basketball because they were tired of losing, and of course all blame was heaped upon the coach. He was too young, too white, too much of an Ivy Leaguer. The few parents who were there waited outside the locker room, and it was those tense moments when the team came out that Kyle hated most about his community service. There would be the usual complaints about playing time. Marcus had an uncle, a 22-year-old former All-State player with a big mouth and a fondness for bitching about Coach Kyle's unfair treatment of the best player in the league. From the locker room, there was another door that led to a dark, narrow hallway that ran behind the home stands and finally gave way to an outside door that opened into an alley. Kyle was not the first coach to discover this escape route, and on this night he wanted to avoid not only the families and their complaints, but also the agent cop. He said a quick goodbye to his boys, and as they fled the locker room, he made his escape. In a matter of seconds he was outside in the alley, then walking quickly along a frozen sidewalk. Heavy snow had been plowed, and the sidewalk was icy and barely passable. The temperature was somewhere far below freezing. It was 8:30 on a Wednesday, and he was headed for the Law Journal offices at the Yale Law School, where he would work until midnight at least. He didn't make it. The agent was leaning against the fender of a red Jeep Cherokee that was parked parallel on the street. The vehicle was titled to one John McAvoy of York, Pennsylvania, but for the past 6 years it had been the reliable companion of his son Kyle, the true owner. Though his feet suddenly felt like bricks and his knees were weak, Kyle managed to trudge on as if nothing were wrong. Not only did they find me, he said to himself as he tried to think clearly, but they've done their homework and found my Jeep. Not exactly high-level research. I have done nothing wrong, he said again and again. Tough game, Coach, the agent said when Kyle was 10 feet away and slowing down. Kyle stopped and took in the thick young man with red cheeks and red bangs who'd been watching him in the gym. Can I help you? He said, and immediately saw the shadow of number 2 dart across the street. They always worked in pairs. Number 1 reached into a pocket, and as he said, "That's exactly what you can do," he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. "Bob Plant, FBI.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?